we're about to check out the rise and fall of 2D gaming. I just played Streets of Rage yesterday. All right. And the Sega Simulator has online. So I need somebody to help me beat that game. I got to the last level. I used all my continues. Didn't make it to the final boss. But let's get it.
Hey y'all, Scott here. You ever stare in front of the mirror and practice what you're about to say to somebody?
Hey, you know what they say? Go f yourself.
Well, I'm practicing what to say at a family reunion that's coming up. They'd probably say, oh, Scott, it's been so long, talk to me. And I'd go, Dimensions, oh, my favorite. You know, 2D just kind of happened. Nobody went, flat plane, no Z-axis. People have always been after that, their third dimension. It's the future and the solution to all your problems in marriage.
These never work.
The dimension of our dreams, and when we finally got it, I miss garbage. I mean, we could go back before 2D gaming to no D. These were the days. Who are we kidding? It's always been a battle between
Bugsby 3D was a banger, all right?
2D and 3D. You could argue 4D gaming is something like virtual reality, but I will categorize 4D like movies and theme park rides do. If my chair moves, that's the fourth dimension. Maybe someday we'll get a true fourth dimension in gaming, but for now we gotta settle for Frogger 3D being the farthest we can go. These days, it's 2D and 3D
4D,
living
though?
in harmony. But it wasn't always like this, at least on home consoles. It seemed like for a second there that 2D was
Legend
merely
of
a
Zelda,
product of hardware limitations.
Ocarina of Time,
make a 2D game is if you're making
greatest
it for Game
game
Boy or
ever
something.
made.
If you were making a game for the PlayStation 2, GameCube, or Xbox, you knew what dimension to make it. 3D was kind of seen as the new norm for modern console games, but now that status has been changed by Kirby Star Allies. 2D games are everywhere, sitting right alongside 3D ones. But how did it get this way? Well, like I said, 2D games just kind of happened. Do you really think there was a board meeting?
Graphics.
This was just what video games were at the time. This was the extent of what could be done, but 3D was still the dream of many. What if these characters weren't flat? They could walk around in a world, not just some kind of stage play. For 2D games, the top-down perspective was usually the answer to prayers like that, but everything was still so flat, and there were only so many things you could do and places you could go. At the time, though, this was perfectly fine. But then gunshots were heard.
Oh.
Super Mario 64 defined 3D gaming. It existed beforehand, but did it most...
Bruh, this was on Sega, right?
Super Mario 64 defined 3D gaming. It existed...
This was on 6-Pack, right? If y'all know 6-Pack, the Sega Genesis game had the freaking Streets of Rage, Golden Axe, Shinobi, this Mario... Jewel, Temple Jewel, or whatever the junk's called, and one other game. I can't remember what it was.
This is beforehand, but did it? Most 3D games had a hearty dose of quotation marks involved. They definitely were more 3D than not, but too many 2D elements were involved to truly make them feel like there's no going back from this. Sonic 3D Blast. Yeah, okay. Wolfenstein 3D and Doom laid the foundation for the modern first-person shooter utilizing 3D environments, and while consoles dabbled in 3D games prior, the PlayStation and Sega Saturn helped popularize them as a standard, even if these consoles did 2D games a bit better. A system like the Sega Saturn wasn't designed around 3D gaming. It was supposed to be a 2D sprite powerhouse with 3D effects for the backgrounds and such. But they saw the writing on the Christ!
Virtual
if your
Fighter?
console wasn't capable of playing 3D games, well, Thanksgiving's gonna be awkward. This was where the industry was heading, but even though all these 3D games were releasing, they weren't fully taking advantage of this new dimension. They almost felt like 2D games at their core, just with 3D models instead of sprites. Oh, some games just used 3D models but stuck to a 2D perspective. But in came Mario 64, showing just how game design had to evolve. It wasn't the first 3D game, but it might as well have been. It was a monumental moment for gaming. I should know, I wasn't there. But have you noticed around this time, 2D became somewhat of a product of limitations? It almost felt like 3D replaced 2D, and 2D became relegated to handhelds because that's all they could do. Most flagship gaming franchises during this time felt the need to transition to 3D, and 2D
Jay was good.
Old news. The only person that would care about them would be Lincoln, and he's dead! Of course, I'm mainly referring to game series that used to be 2D adventures, which evolved when 3D was becoming widely utilized.
Donkey Kong?
Something like Dr. Mario 64, it makes sense as to why it's just a simple 2D puzzle game, but out of all the action-adventure titles...
Alright, let's see what bangers he got here. What is this? Perfect Dark? I don't know what that is. Majora's Mask, that's a sleeper, alright? You grow up, Ocarina of Time is definitely better. You thought the gap was wider as a child, but Majora's Mask is definitely up there.
It was released on...
we got Ocarina of Time. Is this Smash Bros?
On the Nintendo 64, I can only think of a handful of games played from a 2D perspective. Yoshi's Story, Mischief Makers, Kirby 64. You have Super Smash Brothers and other fighting games, but
Banger.
that's pretty much it.
Nobody
if you
can beat
wanted
me
2D
in that.
Mario, Zelda, or Donkey Kong, you had to play those on Game Boy. It really felt like Nintendo was pushing most games to just be 3D on the 64, which does make me wonder why they kept Yoshi and Kirby 2D during this time. Well, they still used 3D graphics, but kept the playing field 2D. You can only go left, right, up, or down, which created the term 2.5D. What's half a Z? It's a 2D game with 3D graphics, or a 3D game played from a 2D perspective. Dead. Pay attention. The PlayStation and Sega Saturn kept 2D games on consoles alive during this era, and this is where we got some of the most gorgeous sprite art ever conceived. It was brilliantly mixed with visual effects and backgrounds that only these new systems could achieve, and showed that 2D gaming wasn't just a step towards 3D. They were two different beasts deserving the same amount of attention.
We're
This is the era I'm talking about when I refer to the
Metal
fall
Gear?
of 2D gaming. The PlayStation 2,
We gotta play
Xbox,
Metal Gear
GameCube, and Dreamcast.
on
If you
stream,
were making
bro.
a
We
game for
have
these
to.
platforms, it was almost certainly 3D, and if you wanted to make a 2D game, get in the car. 2D games were seen as for handhelds only, and by proxy, less important than the big 3D console games. Case in point, all of these franchises that originated in 2D all got games during this generation. Not
Final
a single
Fantasy.
console entry was 2D. Now, of course, what's
Bro, the original Grand Theft Auto where you see it from the sky view. What a time to be alive, man.
deal? The 2D games didn't go away. You got those games on the handheld. It's like this label. What's there to question? What is this, moonshine or porn? Your 2D games never left. You just had to play them on the handheld. But because of that, they didn't feel like they were considered as important as what was on the consoles. Console games have always been the priority. Sure, you got 2 Zelda games on
When
the
we gonna stream
Nintendo DS
next?
in
We
between
might
console
stream tonight,
entries,
if
but
not tomorrow,
literally
for
every
sure.
time people talk about the history of Zelda games, they always say, Twilight Princess came out, then Skyward Sword. It's almost like handheld games were treated as spin-offs sometimes, even if they had just as much, if not more integrity as whatever released on consoles. But in the end, they just weren't considered as important as console games. These handheld titles sold more than their console counterparts, but
That's
you'll
crazy.
rarely hear people talk about the portable games. It's all about the home console ones. It's something that's always perplexed me. I always see Nintendo, Sega, Capcom, Sony pull from their classic home console games for nostalgia bait, but barely ever do so with their handheld titles by comparison. Well, I guess it's because normally console games get the
I
bigger
gotta play God of
budgets,
War,
the bigger
bro,
teams,
too.
and the bigger scopes because they can handle experiences of that size, and thus they're the bigger deals. Portable systems couldn't do as much, so budgets for games were generally smaller, and thus people generally saw games that released on handhelds as lesser and not as important than the console games. Grand Theft Auto Advance released the same day as San Andreas. Guess what happened? Most of the time, handheld variants of these series would be put in sub-series, with the console entries being direct sequels to one another. Basically, the most a lot of these handhelds could get would be prequels, side stories, etc. Systems like the Game Boy Advance could do some very light 3D stuff, but 2D was where it was most comfortable, so this was how 2D lived on at the time. Though with everything I said earlier about handhelds were home to the lesser experiences, it made 2D gaming feel unimportant. If any generation made this style feel like just a simple stepping stone to 3D, it was this one. I mean, previously you got games like Castlevania Symphony of the Night on PlayStation, but if you wanted games like that in the following generation, you had to play it on the Game Boy Advance, because the type of Castlevania game you got on consoles during that era was this. 2D games were relegated to the Game Boy Advance because that's all it could realistically do, and with these games being cheaper, smaller titles on weaker hardware, 2D was seen as inherently worth less than 3D. Now that doesn't
I like
mean
3D
2D was
games better, I ain't
completely
gonna
off the
lie.
GameCube, PS2, and Xbox.
I think for fighting though, I don't like 3D fighting games. When they came out with Dragon Ball Z Tenkaichi, get it out of here. Pack it up, ball it up, throw it in the garbage. All right, it was trash. Now you stick us to Brawlhalla, Smash Bros, all of that. It's cool. I never even played Def Jam Fight for New York. I seen the gameplay, probably wouldn't play it. I don't like wrestling games. Okay. 2D fighting games are superior.
The Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Adventures on GameCube had a graphical style incredibly reminiscent of A Link to the Past on SNES, though now with all kinds of effects and crumbs on the screen. Looking at reviews, critics liked a lot about it. Outside of the graphics. A series that consistently were 2D only skipped main entries on consoles during this time. Classic Mega Man, Kirby, Yoshi, and when they wanted to do something like a new Mega Man X game, X7 was this new experiment bringing the series into 3D, with the next entry showing us just how well that turned out. X8 brought things back to a 2D perspective, releasing around 2005, which is where the rise of 2D started to occur. Xbox Live Arcade initially started out on the original Xbox, hosting games along the likes of arcade classics and some original very simple games. You could download these games for a relatively small price, but when it made its way over to the Xbox 360, it blew up. Xbox Live Arcade became a breeding ground for smaller, bite-sized games, not just classic arcade titles. It helped create a market for simple, cheap experiences on a home console. Much like how the pick-up-and-play games worked well on handhelds, they worked just
I remember playing that. This was my game.
Home console. Much like...
What was this called? Can't nobody beat me in this either, man. I was the GOAT.
How the pick-up-and-play games worked well on handhelds, they worked just as well as downloadable games on the TV, as you could just hop into them, play them for a bit, and hop out without swapping discs. This was a godsend for retro stuff, making the classics easily accessible to the masses. Instantly downloadable, the games were smaller in file size and simply due to their age.
Bro, this just unlocked so much. Look at that, yo. Yo, we was really in the golden era. The original Xbox is a goated system, okay? It go like the rankings is PS2, Xbox, Nintendo 64. Top 3 consoles ever invented.
Which made them perfect to just always have at a moment's notice on our 360s. And I think this got people to realize, wow, this isn't dog shit. 2D retro-styled games still had a place on the home consoles. There's merit to these games existing right alongside the big bombastic 3D ones. So
we might have to put, it's between them 3. You can interchange them any day, okay? Because Xbox might be over PS2. I ain't gonna lie. The music during the games, the downloading, the Halo, come on, man.
Original downloadable games were starting to get pumped out for the marketplace, some of which were retro reboots of classics, others completely new concepts, all for affordable prices. If you haven't played Peggle because of budget constraints, that's your fault.
The bank is repossessing my body.
And I think
still have
the boom
Xbox
of
360?
downloadable smaller games showed how much value these titles still had. A game like Bionic Commando Rearmed was far more popular than the big, gritty Bionic Commando reboot it was fundamentally made to advertise. 2D games like this were finally making a comeback on consoles, though they were still being seen as worth less than 3D ones. The Xbox Live Arcade era really messed up my perception of price points, as back then they would charge like $10 for a new Space Invaders. Now it's like, I know it's in a collection, but still, it makes me look at something like Ghosts Goblins Resurrection. That released in 2021 for $30 digitally, and I'm not saying it's not worth it. I'm saying the unbelievably cheap prices of digital games from this era makes me initially look at this as overpriced. Yeah. 2D games were still seen as inferior in value to 3D
that? Geometry
titles.
Dash?
In fact, that just goes for various things in general.
On there too, man.
Downloadable games were seen as lesser than retail games. Indie games were worse than AAA ones because they would always denote on storefronts that this was an indie game, this was an Xbox Live Arcade or PlayStation Network or WiiWare game. And thankfully, eventually, they just said, why are we giving these
Castle Crashers? We might have to bring that back, man. We might have to bring that one back.
Games labels, they're all just games at the end of the day. Who cares if it doesn't have a retail presence? Who cares if it was just made by one person? They should all be given the same label, not, oh, well, this is just a downloadable only game, or, oh, this is an indie game. How about, these are all Xbox 360 games? And I think that mindset helped 2D games in the long run, as they were primed
I gotta play Limbo, too. I never played Limbo.
Is easier and cheaper to develop at its core and in general compared to 3D. Now, because of that, you may say, well, then obviously, that's why the perceived value of a 2D game was lower, because they're easier and cheaper to make. And for some reason, people keep pushing that old deal out because it's 2D, it should be cheaper. It's easier to make than a 3D game. Yeah, okay, look up the most expensive and difficult to make movies of all time. Chances are they're the same price to watch as the Poltergeist of Borley Forest. I guess movies may be a weird comparison. I think a comparison people don't make enough are actual games. With 3D games, there's more that can go wrong. 2D is more grounded. There's only so many possibilities. 3D, there's more to take into account, adding to developmental issues. But from what I've seen due to that, 3D games have so much more fluff, more cutscenes, boring tutorials, parts of the gameplay that are just you walking and following somebody and doing nothing else. It doesn't really matter. I have full control of what I do and where I go in this environment if there's nothing to do and nowhere to go. I'm just holding up here. A lot of these 3D games like to give you the illusion of being much more than what they really are.
That's
2D, you can't do that as much because it's more obvious when you do it. You can't bullshit as much as you can with 3D games. And I know this sounds like I prefer 2D, and no, I like both of these equally. equally, but as more and more time passes, it's easier and easier to call 3D games out on their garbage. Like the first time this little narrow hallway passage thing happened, I thought nothing of it, but the 60th game that did it this year? It's obvious this is here to not only mask loading screens, but also increase the time spent playing the game.
Masking loading? I never even thought of it like that. Yo, developers are cooking us right now. Hey, they did their job though, because I didn't even know it was masking the loading screen.
Even if it's only by a few seconds. Which, making any game that lasts hundreds of hours, it's tough. But in a 3D world, you have more space to do more things. A 2D experience can only be consumed in so many ways, which I think adds to the perception that a 2D game is worth less than a 3D one. So regardless of 2D games coming back to consoles in a more substantial way, they were still seen as games that could only be $20 or less. However, I think the main company pushing forward, trying to give 2D games the same value as any other AAA release, is Nintendo. For a while there, Nintendo sort of pushed their 2D games off to their handhelds, which again, devalued them a bit. If you wanted 2D Zelda or Mario, you mostly had to get a Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, but even then, with Mario, from 1992 to 2006, there were no original 2D games produced. They just did remakes and re-releases on the portables, which it's crazy to think there was a time when 2D Mario was basically extinct. What Nintendo did instead was invest heavily into the Wario Land series.
I remember
that was their premier 2D platformer for a bit, but in 2006, Nintendo revitalized 2D Mario with New Super Mario Bros. On DS. It was a sales juggernaut and helped prove that there was still a big audience for original 2D games. With the casual appeal of systems like the DS and Wii, it became more apparent than ever how many non-gamers understood 2D gaming far more than 3D. 3D, you have to worry about a camera system, and it's like, you, I already have a mortgage to deal with.
The second
game like
joystick.
The original Super Mario Bros., most players could deal with. Hell, many found it fun. Super Mario 64?
Join the occult, Dad!
While millions experienced and enjoyed video games, I think this era proved that 2D wasn't just an evolutionary step to take to get to 3D. It was something that was preferable in many ways to millions. It was simpler to understand for casual players, and as great as 3D was, it was too different from 2D to be considered a replacement. I think some people almost looked at going from 2D to 3D gaming as the transition from black and white to color and film. But 2D was mostly relegated to systems that just couldn't do 3D. But in reality, revitalizing 2D games was the ticket to grow gaming that much more. While the Nintendo DS could do 3D games, most of the major titles released on it
I had a
were
DS.
still 2D,
I only had like 4 games
3D character models. And on the Wii, Nintendo started to pump more and more money into AAA 2D console games. This all started with Super Paper Mario in 2007, reimagining the Paper Mario RPG series as a 2D platformer with RPG elements and a gimmick showing you the 3D perspective of your 2D plane. Or maybe it didn't start it, but it showed where Nintendo was heading with many of its key franchises. Backwards! Nintendo has always been a very nostalgia-heavy company. Many times they theme their games around, remember...
Is that Mexican Mario? Who is this?
But that doesn't mean there can't be any innovation with their nostalgia-heavy titles. Their next major 2D console game was Wario Land Shake It. Also,
Yo, whoa.
Any innovation with their...
Who designed this? And what exactly is he doing right here? Okay. Got some freaks. We got some freakazoids in that animation department.
Their next major 2D console game was Wario Land Shake It, also known as Wario Land The Shake Dimension in Europe. It's offensive over there. Wario Land didn't do much sales-wise, but it was a gorgeous 2D platformer on a console with great cutscenes, artwork, and animation. It was clear more time and money were being put into games like this. Even if the title didn't sell well, the intention was there. This was the first Wario Land on a console, and they went above and beyond to make it feel like it. We got Wario World on the GameCube, a 3D Wario platformer, but Wario Land Shake It was traditional 2D as all hell, which was an important precedent to set, because 1 year later, Nintendo went all in on 2D console gaming with New Super Mario Bros. Wii. I remember my aunt wanted a Wii because, well, I loved Super Mario Bros. It clicked perfectly with the Wii's casual appeal. An old school Super Mario Bros. Game, a title like Mario Galaxy, you're gonna give Grandma a stroke with that. It didn't matter that it wasn't as visually appealing or epic and grandiose as the biggest games on the market at the time. New Super Mario Bros. Wii proved that people wanted simple 2D fun on their TVs
I've
just
been out
as much as on their handhelds.
Nintendo's
Plus,
for so
Nintendo
long.
introduced
I only played Switch like maybe like 6 times, and all of them were Smash Bros. I need to get a Switch, bro. I need to. That's the next I'm a PC gamer right now. I don't even know what I'm talking about, bro. We about to head on Steam and get all the games we need.
Simultaneous multiplayer with this game, which became a staple in their modern 2D titles to come. Next
That's
year,
fire.
we got Donkey Kong Country Returns and Kirby's Epic Yarn on Wii. Kirby's Return to Dreamland the next, and coupled with the Wii's downloadable library of old school NES and SNES games,
Oof,
retro-style
I
new
remember that.
downloadable WiiWare titles, and the lower cost of developing games on it compared to Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, the Wii became the go-to console for the resurrection of 2D console gaming. Nintendo definitely noticed that these 2D
The
titles
Switch
appeal to
was,
far more
low-key
consumers
fun?
than ever before. You satisfy the casual crowd with simpler games they can understand. The hardcore community is pleased by
What
the return
games
to the
on
classic
Switch
era
are,
of
like,
gaming.
elite,
Pop a
though?
multiplayer mode on there and all's forgiven. So because of this, Nintendo made another 2D game. And another 2D game. And another. 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 And another.
Nintendo leaned too far into 2D gaming after the success of New Super Mario Bros. Wii. It just felt like they took their 3D games and pushed them off to the side. And even when they did do 3D games, they took too much inspiration from the 2D ones.
Bro, Mario
Wii U
Party
and
used to be a
3DS,
fire
frankly,
game.
had too much 2D. From 2012 to 2016, it almost felt like every other game Nintendo was making was a 2D platformer.
Does he have a
And they're
helmet on?
great, but my god! We went from not enough of them to too much just like that. And you know what? I get it. These 2D games were obviously a smart move because, one, they had wider appeal, and two, they were definitely easier to develop. Like, why wouldn't you make the game that'll cost less to produce and make more money? But that's the problem. Many of these didn't feel like artistic decisions made because they wanted to make a 2D game. They felt like business decisions. Make a 2D game because it's more cost effective. And with a mindset like that, many of the 2D games that came out this generation, while crazy fun, weren't necessarily exciting in terms of what they represented. They felt like another Nintendo game, and that's it. Which I think this was one of the factors that led to Nintendo's underperformance during this generation. The 2D games have wide appeal, but generally speaking, they don't leave the same impact as a 3D one. Nintendo's 2D output felt safe, not cutting edge, but
Yo,
when they
what
would put out a
Mario
3D
game is that, and
they
what's
knock it
the
out of
skin that
park,
he has
which just
on?
kind of left a bad taste in my mouth
That's
concerning
crazy.
their output of 2D platformers. Because it's obvious they can be so much more. Just look at what indies are doing. Some of the most ingenious concepts.
Yo, forget, we're never downloading Cuphead. All right? Never. That game is too hard. All right, I might do it, man. I might do it. I'm going to need some incentives if I play Cuphead, though.
To ever
Because, boy.
grace gaming are coming from just a few people working on their own, and they're being put into 2D titles. And thankfully, the industry started to evolve.
Limbo.
What used to be considered just indie games have become games. Some of the biggest modern successes in the industry come from them, and many of which are 2D games, ones that take inspiration from what studios did years ago, games that they just aren't as willing to put too much time, effort, and money into anymore. And these indie developers help to prove that some genres never die. Just because Castlevania and Metroid gave up for a while there doesn't mean there isn't a market for classic Castlevania and Metroid games like this anymore. The Xbox One's most iconic exclusive, in my opinion, was Cuphead. Donkey Kong Country
That was
came
a
back with returns on Wii and
Xbox
Tropical Freeze on
exclusive?
Wii U after the series was just in a dormant state of spin-offs and re-releases, and it came back to glowing reviews and great sales. These types of games always have a place in the market, and with handhelds and consoles becoming one, we've seen far more games that normally would have probably released on something like the Nintendo 3DS now
Zelda
appear on the
Link's
Nintendo
Awakening?
Switch alongside games like
I don't
Breath of
like the
Wild and Mario
cartoony
Odyssey.
Link
We
games.
see these games appear on PlayStation 4,
I think
or
the
5,
last
Xbox Series X, and
the last Zelda I played was Twilight Princess. I don't even think I beat that. But Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time, can't get no better than that, man.
and they don't feel out of place, which is awesome. Every game on the PlayStation Store has the same worth of each other. They're all games, and the entry level of printing a game on a disc obviously was lowered as we received so many more physical releases of smaller budget titles that normally would have been digital only. That led to
True.
more indie 2D games getting released this way. Even if it was in a limited fashion, a physical release still goes a long way in showcasing the value of said product. And with Nintendo showing there was a market for high quality 2D games on console, we've entered a bit of a 2D gaming revival renaissance within the past decade. Now, 2D Mario and Zelda can live side by side with their 3D counterparts on the same console. Games like a classic 2D Mega Man get bigger budgets and physical releases compared to the Xbox Live Arcade era where they were merely digital only. But one thing I always notice is how the value of these games always seem to be lower. Mega Man 11 was only $30, Sonic Mania was $20, yet these games are far better and gave me so much more to do than something like the Resident Evil 3 remake. So yeah, while
True.
2D games are a bit more straightforward and shorter
The
most of
Resident
the
Evil
time,
remakes,
I'd rather be spending
I'm
that
not gonna say
entire
they're
5-hour
mid,
playtime
okay?
actually playing the game rather than for half of it watching cutscenes that are available on YouTube. Or
He's
even
spitting.
when I am playing the game, it's literally just holding the stick up as the character's walking and talking.
Exactly.
That's not every 3D game, believe me. I love both of these styles equally, and for how often 3D games have filler, 2D games aren't exciting and too safe. You know, it kind of balances out. But the idea that a 2D game shouldn't be priced at $60, have you seen what you're buying? How is this and this?
Bro, listen, I'm gonna tell everybody who wants to be an elite gamer, my advice: ditch the console, get you a PC, bruh. Get you Steam and get you some games, okay? They got some good games on there. They be running sales. $20 games, $3.99. Bang, you there, game, okay? They got some Sega emulators. They got what other? They had when I played Bully, it got like a old PlayStation emulator or whatever it is, so you could play the game. You could get the new releases and just plug in the freaking controller to the PC, bro, and you in there, okay?
And this worth 60, hell, even 70. But Metroid Dread isn't worth 60. It's up to the consumer to decide how much they're willing to spend on a game. If a certain title isn't worth 60 to you, well, it isn't worth 60 to you. That's fine. But to denounce a game's price entirely based on it not having a Z-axis is a little ridiculous in my opinion. 2D gaming has gone from handheld only to dominating Nintendo's entire lineup to being in a great balance with 3D titles. I love I can see games from the same franchise on the same console, both released via physical media at the same price, but from two completely different dimensions.
And then I'd say, what a family reunion! Where did everybody go?
Listen, I'm telling you, get you a PC. It ain't got to be nothing crazy at first. Just a decent graphics card so your computer don't blow up. You know what I'm saying? That's really what you need. And you in there. You in there. I think cyber power, no, listen, I'm gonna be honest with you. Okay? Build your own. But if you need to get a cyber power one to start out, get you one that's customizable. Okay? You take the build, change the pieces over time, you in there. But at least you got something. Because like the cyber power computer I have, it couldn't run streams. Like I couldn't stream on it because like it would start glitching. Y'all remember them days. If y'all OG HollaSquad, you know what I'm saying, then y'all remember the days. So I switched it to my gaming PC only, went back to my old PC. You know what I'm saying? But if you go on Steam, you're going to find some games. Listen,